So while Ollie sets up some tabs, what we'll try and do during the course of, we've got about half an hour, is just show you one example of how the BRISSKit tools work together now to begin to support the kind of workflow process that a research project might involve. Obviously it's very much a demo rather than a working implementation of BRISSKit, but I think it will show you the direction that the BRISSKit platform is heading in, and it will show you how the tools can collaborate or support the flowing of data and information across different aspects of BRISSKit. It's really based around a couple of use cases that we're developing within the Leicester Cardiovascular BRU for these tools. Two projects, one that we've had running for a while that people might have heard me talking about previously, which is BRICS, which is primarily driven by hospital recruitment of cardiovascular patients into a population from which we then use I2B2 to deliver cohort discovery for cardiovascular research projects. The other project that we're just getting started on, thanks to collaboration with our colleagues in primary care and the Primary Care Research Network, is a thing called GemVasc, where we're recruiting healthy patients out in the community, piggybacking on the NHS Vascular Health Check programme. Patients who are coming in to see their GP or their practice nurse anyway for a vascular health check are asked simply whether they would be willing to donate an extra couple of tubes of blood for a research project to look at risk stratification for cardiovascular disease, and on the back of that can then be recruited into the NIHR's national bioresource, or at least the Leicester cardiovascular element of the national bioresource, and we're using elements of the BRISSKit toolkit to support that recruitment process, the monitoring of it, and ultimately data management and cohort discovery. So thinking about that GemVasc project as a place to start, we are looking at using, well, in fact we are deploying this week. We're hoping to recruit our first patient. Sadly today, while I'm here, the first patient is being recruited into the GemVasc process, so I'm really hoping that I don't get a phone call in about an hour and a half to say that the system needs me back at Glenfield. But as things stand, the first patient will be recruited into GemVasc at some point today, and bloods will be taken, and we'll be using CiviCRM, which is one of the open source tools that makes up the BRISSKit toolkit, to manage and monitor the recruitment process. All the recruitment's happening in primary care, but we do all the management of it within the BRU. So what I want you to imagine is that a patient has been consented and recruited out in a GP practice for involvement into the study, and that blood has travelled from the practice to the research centre, and that's what we'll hopefully be illustrating. So the first of the applications that our research team will use would be CiviCRM, and Ollie's helpfully already logged in to a BRISSKit instance of CiviCRM to illustrate what the research staff will be doing. And although Civi was designed with a not-for-profit community focus, it wasn't primarily developed as a research application. It came out of the back of politics, NGO and pressure group contact relationship management requirements, but we've repurposed the CiviCRM object model, particularly around management of cases in the Civi lexicon, to represent recruitment of volunteers or research subjects into individual research projects. So there's a process for manually creating participants, which you'll be able to watch Olly just complete the bare minimum of personal data. This is the point at which I pick on a volunteer in the audience, Adrian Manise, to remember the name and the ID number of the patient that Olly's about to enter into this screen. We'll hopefully be able to demonstrate, bearing in mind Jonathan's warning about demos being the riskiest part of any conference agenda, but we will hopefully be able to find this patient again in other tools within the BRISSKit toolset later in the demo. So, assuming that the patient has given us permission to contact them for further studies, because that's kind of the point of the toolset. There we are. And BRISSKit has hopefully generated a randomised BRISSKit ID. So Adrian's going to memorise that number. I think writing it down is cheating. And can you, is that going to show up as the BRISSKit ID lower down there? So just to prove that really is the BRISSKit ID for that patient, there it is in the permission box. Now, the Civi CRM platform involves its own API, application programming interface, which means that although in this example of using Civi, we've manually entered the patient, the BRU implementation that I was talking about a minute ago for supporting our GenVasc project actually involves pulling all of the patient identities across from our pathology system. So when the bloods arrive in our pathology lab and are scanned in to confirm arrival on the hospital site, that populates a database, and from that database the BRU admin staff can confirm receipt of the samples and thus automatically generate a participant record within Civi CRM. So part of the point of putting Civi at the front of the BRISSKit toolkit is the very flexible way that it enables you to interface with provider IT systems. So having generated a participant, what we're then going to do is go into the study enrolment section, which, as I mentioned, is based on Civi CRM's native Civi case module, and add an enrolment to a particular study. Fortunately, we have a demo study already set up to receive the patient into for a hack day example. So it's a very quick process just to note that the participant has been enrolled into the specific study. Within a study or a case object within Civi CRM, a succession of study activities is defined, which can be as simple as the one that we've used for this demo, that basically at this point has only 2 activities in it. You'll see in a moment that once we carry out the check participant status activity and say that's no longer scheduled, but in fact we've completed that, we've confirmed that the patient is still alive, then the activity workflow is enhanced to show the next steps in the process. And this list of activities can be as complex or as simple as you need it to be to model the real world process. So that's generated the next set of steps for the operator to confirm that the participant's consent form allows particular levels of further involvement in the study. Olly just needs to model or mark those as having been consents been given for, in that case, extracting tissue. And what that does is, having marked that the patient's given consent for tissue collection, that triggers the record for this particular patient being passed to CA tissue within the BRISSKit toolset. Likewise, marking that the participant has given permission for data to be analysed creates a record in I2B2, and so on. We want to also, okay, so what Olly was just highlighting there, or can you do that again? So having marked consent to extract tissue two lines above the one that's highlighted as being accepted, that created a scheduled activity for transferring data to CA tissue. There's a process, once a minute monitoring process, that just checks for those jobs. It's picked up that job as waiting to happen, the data transfer, and it has now finished it. So that job of transferring the patient into CA tissue is now marked as completed. There's a similar process for transferring the patient identity into Onyx for creating an interview, and also into I2B2 for creating the kind of endpoint data store to involve the patient in the cohort discovery process within the project. But to start with, we'll switch over to CA tissue, and you can see the patient being populated into CA tissue once Olly's logged into it. The processes that Olly modelled there of manually confirming consent and manually entering the patient, any or all of those could also be populated through an automatic process. If you had other front-end systems, either within your BRU or within clinical service within your hospital, or in our case in primary care, there's no reason why the Civi CRM API couldn't be used to create a patient or to create the case or record the consent forms. As long as you've got a process that meets the appropriate regulatory framework for verifying consent, then you can model that either manually or automatically within Civi CRM. As I say, the GenVasc process is being fed from our pathology system on receipt of samples. That creates a participant, it builds relationships, and it also creates the study enrolment, all without any operator intervention. So within CA tissue, within the demo instance of CA tissue within BRISSKit, you can see that the patient is being brought across with the demo ID. Adrian, is that the same number? Good. That's really just a way of demonstrating that CA tissue can be used in a completely anonymised form, just using the random ID for patient identities. What Olly's going to do now is just link that patient into a model collection protocol that's been set up within CA tissue. And then within the collection protocol view, we can find the study and the patient. And receive some blood. There's, for our BRICS study, we've built a automated or a fast data entry process building on CA tissue. As wonderfully detailed as those data entry screens are, the process of actually entering information about all of the blood that you might receive during a particular study is quite time consuming. So we've built for BRICS a single data entry process which is keyed to the BRICS study and the BRICS collection protocol that works as a client for CA Tissue's application programming interface. We think that that's speeded up the data entry for BRICS bloods by a factor of about 8 times. In other words, we can enter now into CA Tissue bloods from 8 patients in the time that we used to be able to do the data entry for a single participant into the study, which has made our lab staff an awful lot happier. Our plan for, or one of the plans we have for the BRISSKit Hack Day tomorrow and Thursday is to work on trying to build on that API client to generalize it and make it something that is easily applicable to any study within the CA Tissue framework. So that's a project, if people are hanging around for the next couple of days, that's certainly going to be a big priority for me, and I think it's something that will be of real benefit for everybody who's using CA Tissue. Anyway, I've talked for long enough that Olly's been able to enter some details into this participant for the collection protocol. Just while we're in CA Tissue, for anybody who's not seen it, you've watched Olly entering data about bloods received under a specific collection protocol, processed, aliquoted. What you may not have noticed that you were seeing on screen was the model for sample inventory that CA Tissue holds. So once Olly's submitted that patient, what we'll just quickly do before we come out of CA Tissue is just go down to the storage container map, and you can just see that alongside the collection protocols and the storage of, or the storage of data around individual participants and their samples, CA Tissue also holds a very easy to use visual representation of your sample store, which you can drill down through individual freezers, rooms, boxes, down to the individual samples that you're storing on the patients in your studies. And that's, again, very configurable, and one of the key reasons why we picked up CA Tissue as a part of our solution for studies within the BRU. So that's showing you the individual samples stored against particular participants within a study, held in a particular box, particular rack, particular freezer, particular site. CA Tissue can be deployed either for individual institutions or on a multi-site basis. So a BRISSKit implementation doesn't need to be limited to a single research team. It can be the platform to facilitate collaborative working across multi-sites. So the CA Tissue data, we've seen the transfer of data from Civi into CA Tissue. What we're not going to show you, because it's configured to happen on a nightly basis and we don't want to sit here till tomorrow morning, is that all of the data held in CA Tissue is refreshed into I2B2 within your individual BRISSKit installation on a nightly basis. So that patient, the stub record in I2B2 is triggered by Civi, and then on a nightly basis, CA Tissue passes to I2B2 all of the data held in CA Tissue about samples relating to each of the participants. So by tomorrow, a search running in I2B2 would show not only this participant's questionnaire data, but it would also show details of the blood samples that have been stored in CA tissue, modelling those samples stored in the freezers and fridges within your lab. If a nightly refresh of that data is not frequent enough, and I'm struggling to think of a research project where you might want to get at the data more rapidly than the next day after recruiting a patient into a study, but I imagine it's possible. That can obviously be configured, but for the time being, a nightly refresh is working for us. So out of CA tissue and into Onyx, by the same process, CiviCRM will have populated Onyx with a stub record for the participant that we recruited. And there he is. So it generates an interview ID. And what Olly should now be able to do is actually move into the interview stage, and we've built a very basic demo interview in Onyx just to kind of illustrate the point. So Olly will just very quickly, for the benefit of anybody who's not seen the Onyx interview tool, just quickly run through a small section of our risk factor sample questionnaire, just to show you how it works. And you can see that it checks for inconsistencies in the way that you answer questions. In the BRU, this process is being completed for BRICS by nurses using tablet computers, actually going out onto the wards and in the outpatient clinics. So because BRICS is hospital-based recruitment, we try and get to people as quickly as possible after their admission to hospital or in the outpatient clinic to save them an extra visit into the hospital. Our research nurses, therefore, are planning appointments for people alongside the clinicians. At the end of their outpatients appointment, they then go and see a research nurse and go through the interview process. So that's completed this very brief demo interview for that participant. And again, like with CA tissue, there's a process for the data in Onyx to be exported out of Onyx, ready to be picked up by a scheduled job for I2B2 and loaded into the I2B2 ontologies. So that's getting data in one way or the other. What we'll now do is switch across to I2B2. For anybody who's not used I2B2 previously, there are two primary ways of interacting with I2B2. One, which is what we're essentially going to demonstrate for you today, is this web client. It can be accessed in any standard web browser. There's also a Workbench client which runs on the Eclipse development platform. That therefore requires a small amount of software installation onto the client PCs. The I2B2 native model is to allow anonymized access to data through the web client and a more sophisticated set of user controls through the Workbench, but all of that is configurable on a per installation basis. So particular BRISSKit installations may well vary that, but that's the I2B2 behavior out of the box. What I want you to imagine now is that the process you've just seen of recruitment and data generation through interview tool and CA tissue has all happened several thousand times to build up a population of willing subjects. And what Olly's now going to do within I2B2 is define the search criteria for a particular research cohort, combining some data from a CA tissue derived ontology around the existence of saliva samples in our repository, coupled with, from the risk factor questionnaire, a question about alcohol use. So maybe the researcher's interested in analysing the saliva of regular beer drinkers, was it? I didn't say. Oh, any alcohol. Again, for the specific BRU deployment that we have in BRICS, we've got not simply the two ontologies. Olly, can you just show in the terms again at a very kind of high level? So you can see that at the highest level in this instance of I2B2, there are two ontologies constructed. One for data deriving from CA tissue around what samples have we got and where are they, and one from data generated by the Onyx questionnaire. In our BRU installation, we also have an ontology built from the hospital's pathology system, so we can cross-reference the data that's visible here with recent lab results, and we also have an ontology built based around data that we've derived through the hospital's data warehouse from a number of audit databases that have been populated over the last about 12 to 15 years in some cases, by colleagues in the clinical service in the cardiovascular directorate who have used a number of database systems to populate things like the MINAP and cardiac interventions databases, and we can now access, for those patients who've given us consent under the BRICS study, we can access the data that's stored in those audit databases under their own ontology within I2B2 and build more complex searches to include those data elements as well. Olly's search has revealed a patient set of 4 patients. Can we do any analysis of those within? Yep. So there's not a great deal of analysis you can do on 4 people, but we can at least validate that they are real people. One thing we can do is run an export including their saliva data. So can you drag across to the right hand side just to show in the table what data is going to be. So that's the data that's going to be exported. So it includes references to the actual locations of those saliva samples within the freezers and storage facility. That's data that's derived from CA tissue. And there's a final step for the BRISSKit integration, which is that CIVI export button. So if all you want to do is export the data and run some analysis on it, there's an Excel export, but the CIVI export actually bundles up that group of patients that you've defined in I2B2, passes the group of participant IDs back into CIVI CRM, which defines them as a specific group for use in future studies, so that CIVI CRM can then be used to manage engagement with that group, an approach for recruitment into a follow-up study. For instance, if the study that Olly's just modelled perhaps involves asking people back in to complete a further questionnaire or undergo further diagnostic examinations, CIVI CRM has now built a cohort based on that search criteria run in I2B2, and you can, at the click of a button, send a specific email to those patients, or you can export their contact details, provided that you've got appropriate approvals to have access to the patients being re-identified, so that you can contact them and either ask them further questions or invite them back in for further analysis. Yeah, Adrian.
To do that with particularly built from previous studies.
Yeah.
You have to build that into the consenting process.
Yeah. So the consent levels that we model here involve not only... It was about I'll explain it on the way. It was about to be able to recontact people, you have to explicitly have consent to recontact, not just to carry out an initial study. Within our BRU, we're kind of doing that by default now, that every study that we run involves reference either to BRICS or to GenVasc or to the NIHR bioresource or to a combination of those three, and we say to people, alongside the specific aims of the study that we're recruiting you to, we would like to also include you in one of those populations and contact you in future if you become suitable for a further study, and we collect a yes or no to that level of consent. And for the sake of an extra 20 seconds and another question on a form, it opens up the possibility of being able to build new cohorts. So I think that's hopefully shown you the kind of full circle, recruiting manually into CiviCRM, but as I said, there's no reason necessarily for that to be a manual process in a particular clinical or research installation of BRISSKit. From CiviCRM through the questionnaire and CA tissue, loading that into I2B2, potentially alongside data from other clinical data sources, running cohort discovery within I2B2, exporting that group back into CiviCRM and conducting further follow-up with designated groups and cohorts of patients. What we haven't shown you in this demo is the kind of BRISSKit management layer where you would define who within your particular teams has access and roles within each of those individual applications. All I'm going to say at this point is each of the individual tools has a very sophisticated role-based security model. BRISSKit builds on that, and we are also looking at a number of options for integrating the kind of BRISSKit control layer and role-based security with whatever enterprise solutions you might already use. Obviously, there's an issue of complexity. What we don't want to do is require people to have 15 or 20 new passwords to be able to use the BRISSKit toolset. So we're looking for simplicity in the way that we implement role-based security. One final example from our own use within the BRU, the CiviCRM Drupal install that we use to drive the GenVasc recruitment has LDAP integration directly into the hospital's Active Directory. So all of our staff just log on effectively at single sign-on. For those staff who are within the appropriate security groups, have access directly into CiviCRM and are able to create and manage participants with the same password that they use to log into their hospital network account. Ollie, have we covered everything that you wanted to demonstrate? I'm happy to take a couple of quick questions on anything that we've shown you, but as Malcolm alluded to, I think there's plans in the rest of the day and time in the rest of the day to get down into a bit more detail about individual applications if people have got particular interest in one or other of them. Yeah.
CiviCRM, is it extensible in terms of patient details?
Very much so. Not only in terms of patient details, but you can add custom groups and custom fields to any entity within the CiviCRM object model. So it's fairly basic what we've done so far for the GenVasc study, but by way of example, we've created records within our CiviCRM object model to represent the practices, the GP practices where recruitment's taking place. Each one has a practice code. That doesn't exist within the CiviCRM object model, but the address entity is extensible with custom fields to reflect codes and the way that the PCTs refer to them. So yeah, it's not only the individual contacts that are extensible, but any entity within the object model can be enhanced. Tony?
A general question. So if a group wanted to use much of this system but had their own, if they had their own equivalent of CRM, or maybe they use some other database like the transplant system underlying it, how would they or you go about connecting the bits you've got with the bits they've got?
I'm not sure that that's as much a kind of process question as it is a technical question, and I'd be interested in Jonathan's view. From a technical point of view, based on our experience, all of the elements within the BRISSKit toolkit have been chosen because they're open source, because they've got an open approach to data and to things like having an extensible API that can be worked with. So the work that's been done to link them together has all been done on the basis of open APIs. So it would be very easy to refactor any individual bit of that process and have it receive data from a different source, or have it push data in a slightly different format to a slightly different end system. So from a technical point of view, it seems to me that you could swap out any individual component within the BRISSKit toolset and replace it with a different one, provided the different one that you're talking about played by the same sorts of rules. So it doesn't have to be identical, but it needs to expose some API that's open and well documented. If it does, you can easily write something to do that job. The slightly more difficult question is if everybody in the room has a different agenda to follow in that direction, that's a lot of coding work, and I'm not sure how, as a community, we might prioritise tackling all of those challenges. Yes, they can all be done, but they probably can't all be done at once.
Well, to react to that, I mean, there isn't an infinite number of such tools that
Sure.
are in use, and some are clearly becoming the de facto standards. And I'm imagining that the exchange formats, the API functions, there would be more standardization on those levels, the semantics as well, such that, yes, in the early stages, we'll have to limit how many groups we can work with and adapt to. But I can really see this evolving to a kind of plug-and-play system.
Yeah.
Pick a fix they want, plug their bits in.
Absolutely.
In a very short time.
And that really gets to the heart of why we've started, and I probably started doing this a while ago, referring to BRISSKit, although it's a kit and that's why it's called BRISSKit. I've started thinking of it as much as a platform as a kit, because it's an approach, it's a way of doing things. And once you've got that kind of BRISSKit platform, then people should be able to bring their own tools to the party and just plug them in almost seamlessly. Three.
Does CRM support duplicate participant match?
There's an element of deduplication already built in, but you define your own deduplication rules. So you can allow it or not allow it according to whatever the appropriateness of the context that you're using it in.
Any other questions, please? Okay, I just had one. You commented about the role-based admissions towards the end of your talk. I think about other people issues in terms of training. You mentioned nurses on the wards with tablets and that sort of thing. How have you started to approach that in the context of your project across these various applications, please?
Well, I think one step at a time is the cliched answer to that. In terms of the BRICS project, what I think is probably important is people don't need to use the whole of the BRISSKit toolkit, and within a team there's probably always going to be some people who are doing the data entry and the interviewing. They need to learn how Onyx works. They don't necessarily need to know how I2B2 works or what's going to happen with the data that they generate other than on the most general level. Likewise, people who are going to be running searches in I2B2 don't need to know the intricacies of how CA tissue works. They just need to know how to search for the data. So I guess one of the advantages of the toolkit approach rather than a single enterprise-wide system that tries to do everything in one package is people only need to know how those bits of the toolkit that they're actually going to use function, and that's how we've structured our training.